All right. Well, welcome to those of you who are joining for your first session of our 5 sessions that we're doing this week. And welcome back to those of you who were here yesterday with us for sort of the pre-planning workshop. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about high production video creation. So using an SLR or video camera. Some of the lenses. We kind of have this formatted into kind of 3 separate sections. Rachel's going to talk a little bit about the equipment that you can use. I'm going to dive in with some of the settings that you should be thinking about with your video camera. And then Rachel's going to come back and talk a little bit about some of the storytelling and filming techniques that you can think about as you're actually capturing your footage. So without further ado, I guess I should mention for those of you who are attending for the first day today, and who missed yesterday, I'll give a brief introduction to myself and to Rachel in Studio 149, and then give a brief intro too of what to expect for the rest of the week. So I am Danae Wolf with the Learning and Org Development Unit with OSU Extension. I sometimes forget to introduce myself because I feel like we're like week 5 in these daily drop-in sessions, and I'm like, oh, everybody knows who we are. But some of you might be joining us for the first time today. So we welcome you, and we hope that, that you find this very engaging and productive in your journey to starting to create videos. I'm going to toss it over to Rachel to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Rachel Leggett. I am a program assistant. I work out of the Delaware County office, and I work for Studio 149. It's kind of a homemade production studio that we made in Delaware County. We do a lot of different video production all across the state, different types of videos, different subject matters, and we partner with a lot of people who are interested in making video. So hopefully we can all learn stuff together today, and I'm excited to teach.
Thanks, Rachel. We're thrilled to have you, and we're thrilled to have the cooperation of Studio 149. We have some experts on the call. So I'm hoping, feel free to chime in, anybody at any time, with some additional insights. If you feel like you have something to contribute, that's wonderful. We welcome the interruption. Don't feel like you can't chime in. This is kind of meant to be informal, conversational, based on discussion. So we'll keep an eye on the chat box, keep those questions coming in. Before I hand it over to Rachel to kick us off with today's session, I did want to mention that we are off tomorrow. We do not have a session tomorrow afternoon, but we will be back on Thursday afternoon for our mobile video production session. It's sort of our low production workshop that's going to really be focused on how to create high quality video with like a cell phone or an iPad or other mobile device, what apps to use, what settings to use, how to change those settings. And then on Friday, we have 2 sessions. Our 10 a.m. session will focus on Adobe Premiere Rush, which is a really wonderful video editing application that can be used both on a mobile and a desktop. And then in the afternoon, Rachel will lead us in a session on Adobe Premiere Pro, which is for higher production like video stuff, way more capability with Premiere Pro, but also a little bit harder, a little bit more of a learning curve. So sort of a low production track and a high production track there. So with that, Rachel, I'm going to share my screen, and then we will hand it over to you.
All right. So yeah, as Danae was saying, we're going to focus more on high production, right? So you are the folks that are more interested in video, maybe have more experience. You want to take a deeper dive into the world of video. So I'm going to go through equipment, every piece of equipment that you need in your bag to start filming. And I do have a disclaimer. At times this information can get a little bit technical. I didn't want to cut out a bunch of extra information because I want this information to be available to you. So if you ever have any questions, like Danae was saying, please ask them. I really want to answer. I want to be helpful to you all. So, and I'm also available via email. Send me your questions. I'll try my best. All right, and then we're going to start off with talking about cameras. So there's 2 different types of cameras, DSLR and mirrorless. And the difference between these 2, again, is a little bit technical, but I'll boil it down really simple. A DSLR camera has a mirror inside the camera body, and a mirrorless camera does not have a mirror inside the camera body. So not too hard so far. There's a couple more differences between the 2. A DSLR camera has a viewfinder, whereas a mirrorless camera has an LCD viewing screen. A DSLR camera has better battery life, whereas a mirrorless camera is oftentimes smaller and lighter. So these 2 cameras, these 2 types of cameras, there's not necessarily one that's better than the other. It's going to depend on what works best for you. So when you're looking to buy, first of all, you need to set a budget for yourself. These cameras can range anywhere from a couple $100 to a couple $1,000, you know, set a budget, stick to it. ask yourself, how often are you going to use this camera? Is it worth the investment? Also, how are you going to use the camera? Are you interested in really diving into all those settings, all the functions that are available to you, or are you looking to more point and shoot? Because the truth of it is that phone cameras are really very advanced these days. They're really high quality. And when it comes to buying a camera like this, you might have to spend somewhere around $500 in order to get a camera like this that is going to have similar image quality, or sorry, higher image quality than what you already have on your phone in your pocket. So think about if you're willing to make that investment. And I'm not really going to make any recommendations of what camera I think you should buy, because again, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation, but there are some key features that I highly recommend come in your camera.
Thing that it doesn't really talk about is, okay, so you create this budget. A lot of our participants are working with.
You're good, Rachel.
Sorry. Oh, you're all right. So then the key features that I recommend: full HD video is really, really important. Danae's going to talk a little bit more about what full HD means, but just make sure it says full HD video. Image stabilization is also super important. If you don't have that inside your camera, the image is going to be kind of shaky and it's just not going to look pleasant, and that's not what we want. And also microphone input is super important. If we're doing a lot of interviews in extension, or I'm sorry, in education, you're going to use that external microphone, plug it into your camera. That way you're recording video and audio in the same file.
Rachel, can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
For my own clarity and maybe for the clarity of others as well. Mm-hmm. So am I correct in the fact that a DSLR camera and a mirrorless camera can only shoot up to 30 minutes of continuous film? And in order to do more continuous, you actually have to get a dedicated video camera?
It depends on which type of camera. I have a mirrorless camera. It's a Panasonic GH5, and it can film continuous for over 30 minutes.
Okay.
So it's more of a feature that you're going to have to look at each specific camera and see if it has that feature.
Okay. And I asked that because all of my Canon lineup can only shoot up to 30 minutes in a single continuous frame, which is perfectly fine for most anything that I'm doing. But if you did have, like, I'm going to be doing an interview that we know is going to last like an hour, making sure that you have that capability, or you just know that you have to like restart the camera when it like automatically stops recording, so you don't miss a half hour worth of the interview and then get into post and you're like, oh, hey, where's the other half of my footage?
Right. It's a really good point to bring up. That's a good thing to add into your list of key features that you're looking for in a camera. Then we're going to move on to lenses. So there are three main types of lenses: wide angle, standard, and telephoto. A wide angle lens shows a broad view of the place or scene. A standard lens captures images just as you'd see them with your eyes. And a telephoto lens brings distant subjects closer to you. So you can see the examples I have here. Each one of these photos is taken at the same point. Someone standing in the same spot took all three of these photos. So each lens is going to give you a different frame. You can decide what you want in the frame, and that's going to determine which lens you use. So if you want to show the whole scene, you want to get the mountains, you want to get the lake, you're going to want to use your wide angle lens. But if you want to get those details of the mountain, a telephoto lens might be better for you. So the most important thing when coming to lenses is that not all lenses are compatible with all camera bodies. So make sure that you check what lens mount you have on your camera body and only buy lenses that are compatible with that lens mount. Lenses are kind of a piece of equipment that can really increase the quality of your video, especially the image. Things will get sharper. It gets really pretty when you have really nice lenses, which can be fun, but that also does come with a price tag. So it comes back to that budget. And then we're going to move on to microphones. So there are two different types of microphones: a lavalier microphone and a shotgun microphone. A lav mic is a lavalier is also called a lav mic. These are really great for interviews. So these are the kind that you're going to clip to your subject, or you can get creative with different ways to hide it. You can hide it behind a tie. You can tape it to the inside of a jacket. That's going to increase your production value if you can hide that microphone. So a lavalier microphone comes in wired and wireless. So a wired microphone, as you can see on the left, the woman's holding the microphone, and then it's got that cord that runs into the camera. So that's kind of the downfall of wired microphones, is that you're tethered to one spot. You can't have a wide range of motion. And then there are the wireless lavalier microphones. And that is, there's a, sorry, I see there's some action in the chat box. Yes, I will start talking about memory cards later on in a couple slides. So wireless microphones, there's a receiver and there's a transmitter. One goes on the camera, one goes on the interviewee, and that way that person has a wide range of motion. They can walk away from the camera. The problem about, or sorry, the downfall of those is that they are a little bit more expensive, and you also require batteries in order for them to function. And sometimes they run out of batteries really quickly, so you have to have a lot of batteries on hand. The other type of microphone is a shotgun microphone. So these capture sound a little bit differently. They are better for capturing ambient sounds. So you can attach a shotgun microphone to the top of your camera. That way you can get that ambient sound maybe when you're taking B-roll, and then you'll have that when you're editing later on. So both of these types of microphones are really important. They kind of serve different purposes. So I personally have both, but if you're looking to get into buying microphones, I'd recommend buying a lav mic first, because that's going to be more important when it comes to doing those interviews. And then we're going to move on to lighting. One second. Excuse me. The most important thing about lighting is to pay attention to lighting, I think, because a lot of times people will buy great cameras, really nice lenses, but then they'll put their subject in a dark room and your equipment can only make up for so much, right? So always, always pay attention to the lighting that's falling on your subject. Outdoor lighting, natural lighting is really nice. It's free. Anytime you can film outdoors, that might be a good option. Or even if you're inside, there's a window with natural light coming in, like I have right now, utilize that. The natural light is really good source. If you're outdoors and you're filming, maybe like I often am in a soybean field, there's no shade to be found. The sun's beating down, it's kind of creating harsh shadows. You can use one of these tools here. It's the circular device. It's called a light reflector or a bounce. And what you do is you'll hold that underneath the subject. The light will bounce off of it, come back up at the face, and it fills in those shadows. So that would create, you know, a better look than that bright sun coming down on your subject. Or if you have a large open space with shade, maybe there's a tree in the area, by all means, go film under the tree. That's going to be well lit and it's going to provide a softer light. So when you're filming indoor with lights, this might be the place where you can kind of cut back in terms of cost. There's LED light panels that you can buy that are a little bit more expensive. There's also these CFL light kits. There's a ton of those off of Amazon. I know I personally have one. Studio 149 has one. They're pretty nice and cheap. You can also go for clamp lights that you would get at your hardware store. All of these are providing a light source. But the most important thing, number one rule, is no hard light. You can see in these pictures, the direct sun, the hard light, it's unflattering to your subject, and that's not what we want. So never take like a lamp with a bare light bulb and put it in someone's face, because that's just, they're not going to be happy with you, right? So in order to make light softer, we need to use diffusion. So there's different ways in order to diffuse light. If you look at that CFL light kit at the bottom right corner, there are little white umbrellas. Those are more professional diffusion, or those funky looking squares, those are soft boxes. That provides diffusion, so the light passes through, softens it on its way through. Or if you're going DIY with some clamp lights, there's endless ways of different items in your house that you can use as diffusion. I've used shower curtains, wax paper, different things like that. So you really don't have to spend a lot of money to be able, oh look, okay, clamp light with a shower cap, perfect. Yeah, different things like that. It's so easy to make a nice lighting setup in your home or in your office, and you don't have to spend that much money. So it's a fun time to get creative. Next, we're gonna move on to stability.
Yeah, Rachel, just real fast, I wanted to mention here, because oftentimes when we think about like a video production, especially out in the field, so you have these great bounces, right, that you can use. Typically when you're out in the field using those, you're probably going out with the Studio 149 crew, so you have multiple people who can help hold some of that stuff. If I were going out as an individual, and let's say I'm like a one-woman show, I have nobody else to help me, what would be the best setup? And I know you can get like clamps and different tripods, and you can kind of you can MacGyver a lot of this stuff, right? Where you're
Mm-hmm.
just like putting it up on different like sources. But do you have any recommendations for what you might use to actually like clamp some of those bounces off of, or like if you didn't have somebody else like in the field with you?
Right. There is a lot of light stands. This is what the lights are attached to in that CFL kit at the bottom. There's different light stands, super cheap ones on Amazon. And then if you get those clamps, I don't know how to describe other than it's a big clamp. And you just take the clamp, you take the diffusion, and you clip it to your light stand, and that will be perfect. You can use that indoor, outdoor, and that equipment really isn't too expensive. But you're right, sometimes you don't have that equipment, you don't have extra people with you. I even have used my camera backpack, set it down in the field, propped up. There was a time where I was carrying around a white piece of foam board. And I would just set it down so that the light would bounce and then hit into the face. So
I've seen
there's all
foam
different
board
ways.
used before. Super cheap, super effective too. So that's great. Thank you.
Yes, yeah. All right, so stability, right? As I mentioned before, another important element, we don't want to give our viewers motion sickness when they're watching our videos. So tripod is number one most important item when it comes to stability. When you're doing interviews, you don't want to have to hold your camera the whole time. The handheld look, you know, the footage isn't going to look that good because it's going to be shaky. Your arms are going to get tired. So using a tripod is really important for interviews. You want a tripod that is sturdy enough that it's going to hold the weight of your camera, but not too light so that, but not too heavy so that you can't carry it around in the field. So try to strike that balance. And I think with tripods, my experience has been what you pay for is what you get. So, you know, don't go too cheap on it, but like me, one time I bought a $4 tripod from Mark's and I used it for a really long time. And if there was a point where you could see my camera blowing in the wind and you could see the video moving with it. So just get a tripod that is going to do its job. And then another type of stability is a gimbal. So these are going to be a little bit more advanced. This isn't necessarily a staple item I would say that you need to have. How it works is you've got this device that your camera is mounted to, and there is a motor on it. So when you move your hand, the camera itself is being stabilized by the motor. So any movement that you make is going to be super smooth and nice and cinematic. So this is an item that if you are really getting into video, you're really interested in it, and you want to increase your production value, a gimbal would be a nice purchase. And now we're going to move on to last couple pieces of equipment, SD cards and batteries. So I saw there was a comment earlier about having fast SD cards. I'm happy that this is already in people's brains, because I think a lot of times SD cards, people kind of, you know, they're not really looking at the numbers. They're maybe looking at how many gigabytes it is, and that's about it. So what we need is a fast memory card to record the video as fast as it's coming out of our camera. If we have low quality SD cards, our high quality video is going to be for naught. So when you're looking at buying an SD card, high capacity is important. I recommend probably getting 64 gigabytes just because if you're filming interviews, you really just don't want to run out of space during that interview. It's inconvenient to you and the person that you're interviewing as well. I also suggest always having 2 SD cards on you at the least. That way you've got your one main card that you know you're going to use that day, and then you have a backup card just in case something should go wrong with your first card. Maybe you end up doing 3 interviews instead of 2 interviews, because we all know that kind of thing happens. Things get sprung on you. So definitely have 2 cards at least. And then speed class. This is what we've been talking about having a fast card. So this can get technical, and I don't want to pull everyone into the weeds with this one, but when you're looking at cards, there's basically 3 symbols that show you that this card is compatible with recording full HD video. So you're going to want to get one with that 10 with the little circle around it, the 1 with the U around it, and the 3 with the U around it. And I'm so sorry that they're so tiny. Those are the symbols that you're going to want to look for. And then batteries. Batteries get their whole own half of this slide because I think they also can get overlooked. Having batteries that are charged and ready is so important. A lot of times when you buy a camera, it's going to come with maybe 1 battery, maybe 2. But it's important to buy extra batteries, go out of your way to buy extra batteries for your camera. I personally have 5 batteries for my camera, and I've got them labeled 1 through 5, and that way I know I start the day with number 1. When 1 dies, I move on to number 2. When 2 dies, I move on to number 3. So that's just my system. It might be crazy. You're welcome to use it. It just helps me keep organized to know, okay, so I've got batteries 4 and 5 left. I've got an hour left to go of filming this event or filming, you know, this show. So I know that I'm on the right track. Oh, thank you. Um, so also keep in mind, there's a lot of equipment that you need batteries for. Think through every piece of equipment that you've got in your bag, right? So your wireless lavs. If your wireless lav runs out of battery during an interview, that's happened to me multiple times. Depending on what kind of wireless lav you have, they can kill batteries quick. So keep those on you. If you have a gimbal, that might run on batteries. Always keep in mind all of your equipment, have batteries prepared for all of them. You don't want to have your day cut short because you're not prepared. And then with that, that is all that I've got, I believe. And we're going to pass it over to Danae. She's going to talk about how to use this equipment.
Yeah, so one more thing I wanted to mention here with memory cards and batteries, and this is going to be different across like any camera that you get. So for example, I film primarily with a Canon 5D Mark IV, which actually has 2 memory card slots. It has a compact flash and an SD. I'm not sure why they have 2 different types of card slots, but that's one of the things you might consider if you don't have any video camera, but you're looking at investing in like a high quality camera, you might look for one that has 2 card slots. Another thing that you can get in terms of battery is some cameras, probably most cameras now, will accommodate an extra, like a battery grip that would actually mount into the tripod mount on the underneath of the camera. And it allows you really to shoot like vertical if you needed to, especially for photography, but it's a battery grip. So it actually has an additional battery in it, which of course then lengthens your battery life. So if you know you're gonna be doing a lot of shooting, you might wanna look at a camera that has some of that functionality too.
Yes, those are great points to add. Thank you.
Yeah, so before we really jump into settings, this is going to get technical. So for anybody who is very, very new to video production, one of the things I will mention here is I am looking with the LOD group, maybe with the help of Studio 149, at producing maybe some like just simple guides, like a 1-pager on like, you're going out into the field, make sure you understand like this for settings, just kind of a handy guide to keep with you. But if you don't understand anything that we talk about in the next few minutes, please don't hesitate to stop. Sometimes I don't even understand some of this stuff. So don't feel like, oh, I don't want to ask this question because, you know, somebody might think that I look dumb. You don't. Like some of this stuff really gets into the weeds. So don't hesitate to stop us whenever. So we wanted to start in settings about talking about resolution, and this matters a lot depending on where you plan to distribute your video. So basically like the output, it traditionally now, like most of what we see, regardless of whether it's like on, you know, Facebook or Instagram or YouTube, is probably going to be shot in 1080. This is this gold box here. And the resolution is basically, is it pixels per inch? Is that pixels per... Rachel, is it pixels per inch? Do you know? When we talk about resolution, pixels per side.
It's either PPI or DPI, and I get them. Oh, okay.
PPI is per inch. DPI. Dots per square inch would be like, yeah. But it's basically how many pixels are like fit into the screen. Again, most of what we see now is going to be 1080 to 1920. This is considered full HD. If you have watched any of our recordings from these Zoom sessions, they have been recorded in 720. So we are limited by the university to recording playback in Zoom to only 720. 720 is smaller, so it's going to take up less space, but it's also less quality. So sometimes people are like, well, 720 is fine if you're just like posting a video on social media. Generally, what we would expect to see on social media these days is something in full HD, which is 1080. You might have a camera that can shoot in 4K. And 4K is overkill for the majority of what most of us are probably going to be doing if we're shooting for something on Facebook or YouTube. 4K does come in handy though if you're filming something that you might think, hey, this might turn into a short film that I could submit to, let's say, a film festival. You might want to shoot in 4K because it's going to be displayed on a larger like theater screen. So 4K is going to come in handy. The added benefit of shooting in something like 4K is you can actually zoom in and crop out a good chunk of that video. In fact, 3/4 of that frame you can crop out and still achieve full 1080. So you have a lot more play with your footage that you film in 480, but keep in mind it's going to be a heck of a lot bigger file size. So you need to be mindful of, let's say, the memory cards that you have. And it's a lot more to shoot. So you're going to fill memory cards a lot faster. The other thing that we'll mention here is aspect ratio. Now my Canon camera shoots in 16:9 aspect ratio. That's pretty common. The reason why I want to mention this is, again, it kind of depends on where you would plan to distribute this. If you're creating a video primarily for Instagram, Instagram has traditionally been that 1-to-1 ratio, right? They've always advertised square photos, square videos. They've changed that now, so you're not limited to only posting in the 1-to-1 aspect ratio, but it still kind of runs on that aspect ratio. So most of what you see is square format. Another point that I want to make here is something that you see in theater tends to be this way, way wider screen. You're probably not going to be shooting in this super wide aspect ratio for the majority of what you're doing. Photography, standard photography aspect ratio tends to be the 3:2 or the 4:3. And I did not mean to advance that slide. And it's not letting me go back. The reason why I bring this up is because you might be in a situation, as I often am as a photographer, where I have a bunch of like film footage, and then I also want to pull in some photos in that final video. And my photos are shot, my camera, it defaults to 3:2 aspect ratio. So I'm trying to pull a 3:2 photo into a 16:9 video. So either I have a black border on either side of my photo, or if I want that photo to fill the frame, I actually have to zoom in, I have to enlarge that photo, in which case it's going to crop out a good chunk of that photo. So it's one of the things to keep in mind if you know you're going to be kind of pulling in some photos that you've taken into a video clip. All of this can be changed. Like I can't change the aspect ratio on like shooting on my SLR, but if you're shooting in a cell phone, and we will talk about this on Thursday, certain apps allow you to shoot like 1-to-1 aspect ratio. You could always take a 16:9 footage into post and you could change it to 1-to-1 aspect ratio, but to change it, what you're actually just doing is cropping out a huge chunk of the frame. So that's something to keep in mind as you're filming too. Like if you're saying, I'm going to do this for Instagram, I'm shooting in 16:9, I'm going to pull it into post, and then I'm going to crop all this stuff out of it. Keep that in mind as you're shooting. Especially if you're not using an app that will allow you to actually shoot in 1-to-1. So any questions about that before we head into frame rate? And again, I know this gets kind of technical, especially if you are not accustomed to using a camera, particularly using a camera in like manual mode. So the frame rate is a measure of how many frames there are in 1 second of video footage. Traditionally, if you go to the movies and you're viewing a movie in theater, what you're viewing is likely going to be 24 frames per second. So there are 24 photos basically crammed into 1 second of film footage. So you can think about this, a lot of us probably used to like either create flip books where you like draw a little stick figure on a bunch of different pages and you flip through it and it kind of animates itself as you do that. That's what we're talking about here. So if you were doing if you were making yourself a little flip book, you would have 24 pictures like per second of like video that you're seeing. Cinematic video is, it's what we're accustomed to seeing. If you're doing anything that's going to be a little bit like artful and you want it to just be like visually beautiful, shooting in 24 frames per second is going to be fairly standard. It's also what we tend to see with things like interview. 30 frames per second is something that we see with a lot of broadcasts. So if you're viewing just like television, like a news station or something, that's most likely shot in 30 frames per second, that's fairly standard. Once we get into the higher frame rates, so 60 frames per second and 120 frames per second, this is where we can start to actually do quite a bit in post-processing. We can slow that film footage down. So for example, if you know that you want to create a really beautiful like panned footage like across a farm field, and you want to slow that down to 50% speed in post-processing, you're going to want to shoot at a higher frame rate, like 60 frames per second, because when you slow that down to 50% speed, what are you going to get? 30 frames per second, because you've slowed it down, and you're still going to have that beautiful 30 frame per second look. So these are really important things to keep in mind as you're shooting. Most cameras, like most even fairly decent cameras, SLRs and mirrorless, are probably not going to be able to shoot at the 120 frames per second, but many of our cell phones can. So if you have like an iOS device, for example, and you go into your slow-mo settings and your camera settings, you usually have the option of selecting 120 frames per second or even 240 frames per second. This allows you to actually slow that footage down so much, which is really great if you're doing anything with a lot of action. Something else that I will mention here is, I don't know if it was all of the Lord of the Rings films or just that one Lord of the Rings film I remember seeing in theater. It was shot in 60 frames per second. It was shown in 60 frames per second. And I remember sitting in the theater looking at my husband, and I kept asking, what the heck am I looking at right now? Like, why does this look so weird? He kept telling me it's shot at a higher frame rate. It's shot at 60 frames per second. So you're not seeing as much motion. It's not what we are accustomed to seeing. So how we view the world tends to be closer to that 24 frames per second. It's how our brain processes the world around us. The 24 frames per second it allows for a realistic sense of motion blur. So if you just take your hand in front of your face, and you could do this right now, some of you are on camera, so you might not want to do it on camera, but if you want to, you can. Go ahead and move your hand in front of your face like this. It doesn't have to be super fast, just sort of a standard, like move your hand in front of your face. You see a sense of motion blur as your hand is moving, if you're actually paying attention to it. This is what we're gonna see with footage shot in 24 frames per second. As we start to get into the higher frame rates, like that 60 frames per second, like that darn Hobbit movie, it starts to look very unnatural. That said, 60 frames per second could be really good if you're trying to showcase something at really, really high motion, because instead of getting only 24 or 34 or 30 pictures in a single second of footage, you're now getting 60 pictures in a single second of footage, which allows for a lot more detail. So I hope that makes sense. We're going to revisit frame rate when we talk about shutter speed here in a second, but feel free to stop at any point if you have questions about that. So let's talk a little bit about the exposure triangle. So for anybody who is a photographer, you're probably well acquainted with the exposure triangle. This is basically 3 different settings that you can set in your camera that will give you, hopefully, a perfect exposure to the scene that you are either filming or photographing. So the first one is your shutter speed. Your shutter lives inside the body of your camera, and it's like a little window that basically opens and closes. And as it opens, it lets light into the camera, and when it closes, light cannot come into the camera and hit your camera's sensor. So you're not exposing anything there. If your shutter is open for a really long time, it's letting in a lot more light, but you're also going to get a lot of motion blur. So slower shutter speeds allow for a sense of motion, and faster shutter speeds slow motion down. Faster shutter speeds are really great when you have a lot of daylight. And again, this is very like photography focused, but it makes sense for film too. Faster shutter speeds are going to be really good if you have really high light situations. You want to slow down that shutter though if you have a really low light situation, just so that you let more light come into the camera. Secondly, we have the aperture. And the aperture, this is a picture of an aperture on the slide, but I'm also going to show you in an old manual lens here. I hope you can see this. As I open and close the aperture here. Can you all see that opening and closing? So the aperture is basically made up of several different blades inside the lens. And again, this is a manual lens, so I have a manual aperture ring on the outside of the lens that allows me to just open and close. We call this stopping down the aperture. This is displayed in what we call the F number. So every lens that you might purchase has an F number. Generally, the lower the F number, we call it a faster lens, because the aperture can open really, really wide, allowing way more light to come into the camera, which allows us to have a much faster shutter. So the shutter is opening and closing much faster because the aperture is allowing more light to come in when the shutter opens. So I hope that makes sense. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper into these settings too in just a second. Finally, we have the ISO, and the ISO is the sensors, your camera sensor sensitivity to light. So back in the film days, this would have been indicated by film speed. So you might have film that was a speed of 100 versus 400 versus 800. The lower the ISO, the less sensitive your sensor is to light. So if you're in a really, really high light situation, you can bump that ISO down as low as it will go, generally around ISO 100. Some cameras can even go a little bit less than that. If you're in a really low light situation, you want your sensor to be way more sensitive to light so that it lets in, it basically doesn't let in more light, but it's basically attracting more light. It's good for low light situations, but you also get some graininess in your film. So it's film noise is what we call it, or image noise. And it generally doesn't look very good. So again, I'm gonna show some examples of what this looks like as we jump a little bit further into here. So first, let's dig a little bit deeper into aperture. And again, this is all going to make sense when we can kind of pull it together and talk about these three things and how you set your settings for film. So the aperture, again, is indicated by F number. The lower the F number, so here we have f2.8, the wider the opening is going to be. And the wider the opening, the less depth of field you're going to get. So if you are filming, let's say, an interview, and you have somebody standing in front of you and they are in front of a background and you want that background to be completely out of focus, you would open up your aperture to be fairly wide. So you might use f2.8, you might have f4 or f5.6. It's really going to depend on how far away you are from your subject and how far away they are from the background that you want to blur. Now, let's say they're standing in front of something and you want to show what the background is. You would stop down your aperture, so the hole becomes a lot smaller, but your depth of field increases. But as you do this, because your aperture is now very, very small, you're letting in a lot less light, which means you have to compensate either by bumping up your ISO or by slowing down your shutter. And by slowing down your shutter, of course, you're going to get a lot more like motion blur in the sense of photography. And again, I hope this all makes sense so we can pull it all together and talk about all three. So here's the difference between different ISOs. So this is actually, I think that you can tend to shoot for most modern cameras clear up into like the ISO 1600 and your noise is not going to look this bad. This image is really just an example, so don't take this at face value. It's just really an example to show you as you bump your ISO up, you're going to get a little bit more noise in your final image. I will say for video as compared to photography, the noise that you're going to see is a lot less noticeable in film than it is in a still image. So that's something to keep in mind. Finally, the setting that we really want to focus on here is shutter, because there is a hard, fast rule that we need to be following when we're shooting film. And that is the 180-degree rule, which basically says that the shutter speed that we use should always be double the frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 1/50th of a second. That means it's staying open for 1/50th of a second. And you might say, well, 24, shouldn't that be 48 because that's double? Most cameras can't accommodate 1/48th of a second, so you bump it up to 1/50th. I do have a cell phone app though that allows me to shoot at 1/48th of a second, so just keep that in mind as we talk about the cell phone session on Thursday. So if you're shooting at 30 frames per second, your shutter is going to be 1/60th, 60, 120, and then 120 would be 1/240th of a second. So again, that's sort of a hard, fast rule. So now let's talk a little bit about pulling this all together. Let's say you're in a situation where you're shooting an interview at 24 frames per second, that more cinematic look. Your shutter would be then 1/50th of a second, which is a fairly slow shutter. You're shooting in a farm field. It's really, really bright. There's no place to go. You don't have a lot of shade. And maybe you have nothing around you that you could even like a tree that you could go under. You know, you didn't bring anything to like offer to shade that person that you're interviewing. Your ISO is as low as it will possibly go. So it is the least sensitive to light. And your aperture is the last thing that you can play around with here. You want to pull this person away from the background, and you do so by having a nice wide aperture. But because you have a nice wide aperture, you're letting a lot more light into your camera. So you're kind of at a crossroads here. You can either stop down that aperture really, really small so that you can actually compensate for the increased exposure. So right now you are so overexposed in your image, but you don't want to do that. You want to pull that person out of the background and have a wide open aperture. So what do? So this is where we start to pull in some extra equipment, and I didn't want to spend a ton of time here, but I did just want to mention it. You can use what's called an ND filter, or neutral density filter, which basically acts as sunglasses for your camera. So the ND filter would go on the end of your lens, and there are a couple different ND filter types that you can think about. There's also varying degrees of, we'll just call it darkness. That's not a super technical term, but like varying degrees of darkness that you can get for those ND filters. You can also stack ND filters on top of one another to increase the darkness that you get. What this allows you to do is compensate for the overexposure. So you can bump that aperture all the way open, and you put those sunglasses on your camera, that ND filter on your camera, and now it allows you to shoot at that 1/50th of a second shutter speed. It allows you to bump down the ISO all the way to 100. So you can get a standard ND filter, which might allow you to add several stops of exposure. You can get variable ND filters, which basically allow you to, it's variable. So like depending, there's like two planes, two pieces of glass, and depending on how you turn them, you're actually getting increased or decreased exposure there. Those tend to be a lot more expensive, but they're really great to have because you don't have to worry about having like a whole set of ND filters. So instead of having a set of 4 filters, you just have one, and depending on how you turn it, you get increased or decreased light there. You can also do a graduated filter, which basically means like half of the filter might be darkened and the other half might not be. These tend to work really well if you are doing anything where you know the sky is going to be really bright, and the sky is probably your limiting factor because that's the brightest part of your exposure. So you can, like the top of your frame, you would have that darkened part of the filter, and then the rest, let's say the person that you're interviewing, would not be darkened. So that's a good choice too. And then we have extreme ND filters, which are really, really, really dark, which allow you to do, let's say, an exposure of, sometimes you might have seen in the past like an exposure of like a beach or something, and it's really, really bright, but you want the motion of the water coming in. So you want to do a really, really long exposure. And that's where you would maybe get an extreme filter. So again, that kind of gets into the weeds a little bit. I didn't want to spend a ton of time on that, but it is something, especially if you're going to be doing a lot of field work, it is something that you probably want to invest in, some kind of ND filter.
Danae, real quick, I just want to make a comment. I have a variable ND, and that like changed the way that I filmed. It's really, really great. And I just want to say I'm a big fan.
So can you explain for a little bit, because I actually have never used an ND filter other than I have a little gimbal camera, and then on our drone, we have ND filters. So can you explain a little bit, like, am I correct in like the variable that there's like 2 planes of like glass, and depending on how you turn it?
Yeah, so it screws onto the end of my lens. You have to make sure you get the right size that's going to fit on the correct lens, right? So make sure those are compatible, just as your lens has to be compatible to your camera body. So then you screw the ND filter onto the end of your lens, and then you sort of just rotate it. And as you rotate it, your screen will show you that your image is getting lighter and darker. And it's really helpful, super quick, your exposure. Most of the time I keep my settings, you know, my shutter stays the same, my ISO stays as low as it can, and my aperture stays wide open. And then I just run around with my ND and I just twist it. And so it's very helpful. So I would recommend investing in an ND filter.
And about how much might that cost? And again, as Rachel mentioned, this is going to be specific to the lens that you're using. So if you have a kit of like 3 or 4 different lenses, all with different like filter sizes, it could really add up. But can you give us maybe an idea of how much that might cost?
I believe my ND filter was around 170, 180. There are cheaper options. I went with a higher end model, but there also, if you have a lot of different lenses and you want to adapt, if you get one ND filter that is bigger than all of your lenses, then you can use what's called a step-up ring, which is just a little plastic ring you screw it onto your ND, and then you can even use 5 step-up rings in order to get your smallest lens to fit onto that ND. So there's cheaper ways if you can make it work to get one ND filter and then just adapt that to all of your lenses.
That's a really great tip there. So let's talk a little bit about focus. When you are working on an SLR or mirrorless, you have the option of doing a manual focus, which means that you're like manually focusing the lens on your subject. This is really great depending on what you're filming. As a macro photographer, and I do some like macro videography as well, I cannot rely on my camera or my lens to find focus. It always ends up focusing on the wrong thing. So this is where manual focus really comes into play. It offers a lot more control, but it's really difficult to maintain a focal point, especially on a moving subject. So it works really well in some situations and it works really poorly in other situations. So this is where you might consider autofocus. And autofocus is probably what I do for the majority of the work that I'm doing. If I'm like filming an interview, or if I'm filming like a landscape or doing like a panned something or another, I probably rely on autofocus. Depending on your camera, you're going to have different autofocus capabilities. So you can set, like you basically tell your camera where you want the lens to be focusing. Like, do you want it to be central focus? Do you want it to be focused on one side or another? And different cameras have, again, way different capabilities on how many different focal points and focal options that you have. But I did want to mention it here because don't feel like you're only limited to manual focus and don't feel like you're only limited to autofocus. You can play with both. And Rachel, do you have anything you'd want to say there? Because you have, I think, a lot more experience. So what do you tend to use?
Well, so different cameras can have different abilities when it comes to autofocus. And unfortunately, the camera that I own and use is notoriously bad for autofocus. So mostly what I do is manual focus. But I guess bringing it back to that equipment side, if you think that you're somebody who doesn't want to mess with manual focus, look into that as a feature on your camera. If you want to prioritize good autofocus, make sure that's one of your key features that you're looking for in a camera. So I do a lot of manual focus. I think I like it a lot. I think it's fun because you can do things like rack focus. You know, if you have something in the foreground, something in the background, I can focus on the item in the foreground and then slowly transfer my focus to the thing in the background. And that's a nice cinematic shot that can add interest to your videos.
Yeah, so that's a really good point too, is the manual focus gives you so much more creative control. And just using your camera in manual mode as like a general rule of thumb gives you a lot more creative control over setting your camera on auto and letting it decide all of the settings for you. Chances are, especially when it comes to video, your settings just are not going to be where they need to be if you're shooting in automatic. So Rachel, we'll kick it back to you.
Sorry, I was muted for a second. All right, so we're gonna end today by kind of building off of some of what we set forward yesterday when it comes to B-roll and storytelling, but we're gonna go more in depth as to how that's actually done in the field. Because, you know, not necessarily all the time you have the luxury of having a storyboard, having a script. So in my time with Extension, I've kind of come up with some tips, some best practices for how to be a filmmaker in Extension. So, Danae, would you mind going to the next one? So my first tip is, if it's possible, conduct the interview first. I know this might not always be the case, but a lot of times what the work I'm doing is I'm interviewing somebody and I'm capturing B-roll to pair with that. That's a lot of the work I do. That's probably a lot of the work that you guys are looking into doing. I'll get a call that a farmer's going out in the field. We've got to go get B-roll of them spraying, and then I've got to do an interview about the spraying, right? So if you can, conduct the interview first. That way, that's basically your script that lays out all the information that's going to be contained in your video. Then while that interview is happening, you can kind of sit there and think, okay, so I can get a shot of this, I can get a shot of that. You're building that shot list in your mind so that way, once the interview is over, you can just run, grab all that B-roll that you've already planned out, right? So maybe in the interview, the farmer says that they had some bug damage. Then when you're walking around in the field, keep an eye out for that. You spot some, get that B-roll shot. That way, that'll pair really nicely with the information that farmer is setting forward. You can see that information visually on screen, and that's really how A-roll and B-roll can combine to visually tell that story. The next tip is to film with editing in mind. So I think if you go out into the field and you're not really thinking about what the final product is going to look like, sometimes you can come back to the office, you're editing, and you've got 20 shots of the same thing. You know, maybe you're filming someone who's doing a soil sample. You're going to have 20 shots of that person the full body doing the soil sample, because that's, you know, that's the first shot that comes to mind. That's the first thing that you think when you think of someone taking a soil sample. But if you edit that together, it's not really going to have an interesting feeling. You're not getting a full picture of what that subject is, of how everything that actually goes into taking a soil sample. So when you're doing that, think about, okay, so there's a soil probe. I should get different shots of that. I should get shots of it in action. I should get shots of their hands pushing into the ground. I can get shots of the soil in the bucket. There's all the different parts and pieces that go into taking a soil sample. You should get footage of each part and piece. And then while you're doing that, diversify the shot type. Do different types of camera movements, right? So close-ups, wide shots, get that wide shot of the farmer taking the soil sample. That is an important shot to have, but then get close up, get their hands on the handles pushing the soil probe into the ground, get down on the ground, get at ground height and see that probe coming out with all of the dirt inside of it. So that's ways to add visual interest to what you're doing. It really captures the subject, so you understand truly how to take a soil sample. And then camera movement too. Think about how it's interesting in ways, you know, if the soil probe is moving, move with it, move against it. There's so many ways that you can have fun with something that seems very simple and mundane. So real quick, I'm gonna show you a video. If Danae, you wanna, there we, okay. I'm gonna share my screen. And I'm going to show you a video that I did in the Delaware County Fair. I interviewed some 4-H'ers about their livestock projects. And so this is going to really give you an example of B-roll and A-roll and how that combines to tell that visual story. And pay attention to the different movement I provide, different types of close-ups, and different varying shot types.
Hi, I'm Juliana Andres, and I live just outside of Delaware.
My name is Caleb Durheim, and I currently live in Sunbury, Ohio.
My name is Caden Shannon. I'm from Moringa, Ohio. The projects I'm bringing this year are vegetables, horses, rabbits, ducks, and chickens.
I started showing beef cows because it was something that I had always grown up around. My siblings had done it, and they made so many friends through showing that I just wanted to have that experience as well.
Goats, they have so much personality. Like, you can just let them out, they run, they chase you. They're just so much fun to have and to work in the show.
So what I like most about 4-H is all the animals that are here at fair and explaining what we do to all the public that don't have much knowledge about ag and the 4-H and how all of this works.
The Delaware County Fair, the people is probably #1. Just getting to go out, talk with people, just to kind of like interact with the general public is just really, really fun for me.
Okay, so I'm sorry if Caleb blew out your eardrums. I should have known that he was so loud before the interview started. So you can see I use a lot of slow-mo when I film. I think I really like that style. I think it brings a lot to the table. It makes everything look really smooth and cinematic. It conveys emotion at times. And the way that I do this is I will film all of my interviews in 24 frames per second. That's my standard. And then when I'm filming B-roll, what I do, this is my little cheat kind of, is I film all of my B-roll in 60 frames. That way I've kind of got the option where I can play it back as 60, and it's, you know, it's gonna kind of look like the Lord of the Rings, and I don't really like that look that much, but I always have the option to make something slow-mo. And I like the ease, the compatibility of that, because a lot of what I do is collect footage and then use it in multiple different videos over time. So I really like that style. And not everyone likes that style. So some people, I think it's a little bit lazy, because it is kind of, it's really helpful when you're out in the field and you're filming and your arms are getting tired and your footage is getting shaky. When you when you slow it down, it really just smooths it out. It buffers all of those little bumps, you know, when your arms gave out on you, everything looks really smooth and nice. So it's kind of something that you can fall back on that's going to make your video production, it looks higher quality when it might not necessarily be higher quality. So it's up to you, you know, come up with the style that you like when you start filming, see if that's something that works for you. If not, you know, it's up to you, have fun, figure out what style you like the most.
So Rachel, I was going to ask, just for context, how long did it take you to make that Delaware County Fair video?
So actually what we were doing with the week of the fair was I would go in the morning, do the interviews, catch the B-roll, and then I would go home, edit, and have that video posted by the evening. So this was a one-day shoot edit.
Mm-hmm. And I ask that just because sometimes I think when we see really beautiful videos like that, when we see the final product, we think, oh my gosh, that must have taken ages to produce, right? But these were one-day projects for you.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously you're a pro at this. But I still just wanted to emphasize, like, this can be done, and it can be done fairly quickly, but it does take that level of planning, right? But yeah, I mean, to be busting out videos, especially for something like fair, when you know, you don't want to take all this wonderful footage of fair and then post it a month later, because fair's over, you know, so who's really going to be paying attention at that point to fair? But it's doable.
Right. Yeah. It's a hard go, you know, I did some videos the whole week, and it's hard to keep up that amount of time pressure to put on yourself, but it is definitely doable. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Rachel, did you have anything final that you wanted to talk about?
I don't think so. I think that was everything that I had.
Okay. So the last thing that I wanted to mention here before we wrap up and open up for questions is we are doing this summer safety video challenge that we announced yesterday. So for anybody who wasn't on the call yesterday, this will kind of be new information. We also posted about it in our Facebook group. So we are asking people to create a 30-second storyboard for a summer safety tip, which could be anything that Extension might tell people as a summer safety tip. It could be related to food safety at a picnic. It could be related to sunscreen use. It could be related to like lawnmower safety or safety around, you know, bees and getting stung by bees. It could be anything. We're asking just for a 30-second storyboard. You can submit those to us at go.osu.edu/summer safety, or you can email them to me at wolf.540 by this Friday at 5 p.m. And then we will review those, and we will be picking some winners that we will announce next Friday. This is a just for fun project, no strings attached, but it is just kind of allowing you guys and giving you the time to really employ the skills that hopefully you will learn this week. That storyboard could be a beautiful visual, you know, frame by frame storyboard, or it could just be kind of a written script that you want to submit to. But we're looking forward to seeing what you come up with. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here, and then we will open it up for any final questions.